Hello and welcome back. This is the week 6 lecture. So today I want to talk more about summarizing. We already have a little bit of experience with this practice or technique because we were working on annotated bibliographies last week, and obviously those included at least a brief summary of each source that you put on the bib. So we've already been doing a little bit of summary, actually going all the way back to week 1 and week 2 when we were first looking at some articles. We were annotating, underlining, jotting down questions, and then at the end of that work, we were trying to write down brief summaries of what we read. So we're continuing to do that here in week 6, but we're going to get a little bit more organized and we're going to get a little bit more in depth. So our next major assignment is an extended summary of one of your sources. So we'll talk more about that. It's coming up at the end of week 7. So let me tell you what's happening here in week 6. I'm going to do things a little bit differently this week, not super different, but I just want to let you know that there will be 2 parts to the week 6 lecture. This is part 1, and here in part 1, I'm only going to cover summaries. I'm only going to talk about summarizing and sort of our structure, our way of doing it. So that's part 1. Part 2, I will post later in the week, either Wednesday or Thursday, and part 2 is going to focus on paraphrasing and direct quoting. Those are other techniques or strategies that we can use in extended summaries. So I will make this clear a little bit closer to time, but just remember that our summaries eventually are going to include direct quotes and paraphrases as well. So we're going to be spending the next 2 weeks working on our extended summaries, putting them together, learning all of these different techniques. So I'm going to go ahead and post a sort of supersized week 6 lecture with part 1 covering summary and part 2 covering quoting and paraphrasing. And then next week in week 7, we won't have a new lecture. You guys will have all of week 7 to work on your extended summaries using all of the information that I'm giving you here in week 6. So I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, email me and we can talk more. But if you go into the week 6 overview, you'll see pretty much all the content that I'm going to be covering both today and in part 2 of the week 6 lecture. So I have stuff on summary, I have stuff on quoting, and I have a little bit on paraphrasing as well. So all the content's there in written form, and it will all be here in the module in lecture form by the end of week 6. So just keep that in mind. But for now, let's just talk about summarizing. So again, we're pretty familiar with summaries. This is something that we've been doing. We've been reading summaries and writing summaries for a long time throughout a pretty good portion of our educational careers. So this is not really a new concept, but in 102, it becomes really important that we understand how to do this well. We have to become proficient at summarizing. It becomes a very important skill in this class. But again, going all the way back to the Area 51 article that we read at the very beginning of the semester, we have been practicing some of our summarizing skills. So what you need to remember is, so far we've been working a lot on reading. And we've been working on, especially early in the semester, we were writing down notes, underlining, asking questions, all of these things that will help us to become more critical, more active readers. And that's great. We're continuing to do all of that, hopefully. But remember, all of that stuff is really a means to an end. The annotations, the questions, the words or sentences that you underline or highlight or put in brackets, all of that stuff is helping you to do later work. Important stuff that you need to do later on down the line. And an example of one of those important things that you're going to use your notes and your questions and your underlining to complete later would be a summary. And that's the whole idea. The summary is the recording of the main ideas and sort of your main takeaways, your main impressions of whatever it is that you read. You're basically recording your understanding. You're putting it down in paper in complete sentences and complete paragraphs, and potentially you might be able to use it later. And even if you don't, the summary itself, just the act of writing it and looking back later and reading it, will help you in the future. So let's just get a very basic definition for what a summary is. We probably already know, but I like to work with the same, I like for all of us to work with the same definitions for some of these terms. So for us, a summary is a condensed restatement of a text's main ideas and most important parts. So the key word there is condensed. You cannot cover everything in the article or book chapter that you are looking at. You're going to have to condense and shrink down, which means leaving things out. And that sounds pretty good. If we're looking at a long article, we might think, yeah, I would very much like to leave some of this out when I write about it. But in reality, that's what makes summarizing a bit difficult. A lot of it comes down to selection. You have to pick the most important ideas, the most important points, the most important types of evidence that you see, and you have to leave out a lot of the other details in order to make your summary nice and brief and efficient. So, of course, you can't include every single detail or every single statement from the text that you are summarizing. So you have to focus on the big ideas, the main points, and perhaps the most memorable examples or the most memorable uses of evidence. You have to be really selective. Also remember that summaries must always be in your own words. Okay, that's what makes the summary different from the original source material. So yes, you're not adding anything new to this. This is not creative work, but you are using your own words. Now, as we're going to see later this week, yeah, we're going to be doing some direct quoting a little later on, but when you're actually summarizing, the words should be yours. The ideas are, of course, the author's. The author of whatever article or book chapter you're looking at. So remember that, and also remember that you don't want to add anything new to the summary. And you're not adding any personal opinions. You're not adding your personal responses or your feelings. We're going to do that later in the semester. We're just not there yet. So summaries need to remain objective, neutral, at least as neutral as possible. We all have biases, but let's not let them show just yet. Let's try to conceal them or kind of fight to overcome them when we are summarizing. We just want the facts. We just want the most important parts of the source. No opinions, no personal response. So really, you're keeping yourself out of it. This is not personal writing. We are not talking about ourselves. We're focusing on creating sort of a condensed but still accurate overview of whatever source it is that we're looking at. So if we're kind of thinking about this as a process, a multi-step process, obviously step one is going to be read the source. Obviously, you can't summarize until you read, and you really need to read all of the source. And we talked about this over the last couple of weeks. You have to make some decisions about the lengths of the sources that you choose. If you know that you're not going to read a 50-page academic journal article or maybe a book or a really long book chapter, then maybe don't pick that source. And again, you can't exclusively work with short sources, but you need to find stuff that's manageable for you because you need to read the entire source. Skimming is not later in the semester, once you have a good handle on these sources, skimming is fine. But when you're discovering them and reading them for the first time, you need to be thorough and you need to read closely. So obviously that's step one. Read the whole thing, and as you're reading, do our old-fashioned style of annotating. Jot down notes, underline key stuff, write down any questions that you might have. And a good way to kind of practice some of this, and I'll point this out as we move along, is try to start with just individual paragraphs before we jump into trying to summarize entire articles or entire sources that we have already, because of course we all have some sources by now. But before we jump into trying to summarize entire sources, just grab one of your sources and maybe pick a paragraph at random. It can really be any paragraph in the text, and just start by summarizing that paragraph. Read the paragraph if you haven't already, and then work on sort of following the steps that we're going through today with that particular paragraph, and then you can sort of take all of those steps, and later in the week you can start applying them to the entire source. So obviously you want to read first, and of course take notes, do all that good stuff while you're reading. Then you want to go back, and now you're really hunting for stuff that you can use directly in your summary. So if you guys open up the PDF of this week's reading, we don't have to go through this word for word, but I just want to point out some examples on pages 76 and 77. If you open up that PDF, it's called Summarizing Sources. But they start by summarizing paragraphs. So if you guys look at the example on page 76, sometimes if you're looking at individual paragraphs, it's always key to glance at the topic sentence, the very first sentence of the paragraph, because oftentimes authors will be announcing what the paragraph is going to be about in that topic sentence. So they show you an example of this. Oftentimes that opening topic sentence almost summarizes the paragraph for you. So you can see an example on 76. They find that the first sentence of that paragraph kind of provides a little bit of a broad general summary. And it's a little bit more comprehensive than what comes at the end of the paragraph. But basically, they're pointing out that at the very beginning and the very end of the paragraph, we have potential summary sentences. So some paragraphs, some sources will have summary sentences built in, already provided by the author, and all you have to do is find them and then put them in your own words. So that's pretty easy, but it's not always going to be that easy. So look over on 77. The paragraph actually starts at the very bottom of 76. So here we have another paragraph. We don't really have a summary sentence necessarily, but they recommend that we get started on the summary of this paragraph by kind of just grabbing key phrases. And they list a few and they circle a few in the paragraph. So we can just grab some key phrases and jot them down in whatever order we want. It can just go in chronological order, in the order that we see them. And then once we have them written down, we can start taking those key phrases, putting them into our own words, and now we're maybe assembling our own sentences, our own overview, our own general condensed overview of what that paragraph is saying. Because you need to keep in mind a sense of scale, right? So if we're summarizing just a single paragraph, our summary is going to be short. We just wrote short summaries in our annotated bibliography, but if we're just tackling a single paragraph, we could potentially just write a single sentence summary, and that would probably be appropriate. On the other hand, if we are tackling an entire source, if we are summarizing a complete source from start to finish, and maybe it's a 15-page article, obviously our summary will need to be longer. So yeah, just look at these examples in the PDF. I think it's kind of helpful to just see what this work looks like in action. And also on page 77, they recommend that, yeah, even though you've strung together these key phrases, don't just try to quote them all. Don't just regurgitate everything that the author said. Write your own original sentence. Look at what they do here on 77. They say it's better to construct an entirely new sentence of your own, and then they show it to you, beginning with "in John Holt's view." So that's an original sentence written by the student, but it's based on all of the key phrases that we underlined or circled in the text, and now we're just assembling them in our own words, in our own sentence, and that becomes a good, brief summary. That's basically how this works. So it's not super complex, but it takes time, and it takes a certain amount of thoroughness. You have to be thorough, and you have to read closely, and you have to have a good handle on your source, whether it be just an individual paragraph or the entire article. And again, this seems obvious, but students sometimes overlook this, either because they're short on time, or maybe they have questions about the article, but they just don't want to ask. They don't think it's terribly important, but I can't stress enough that, you really can't do good summarizing work. Good summary work until you fully understand your source. You just can't. So don't skip steps. Don't skip over the reading part, and don't skip over that moment where you ask yourself, do I understand the argument that the author is making in this source? And if the answer is not a very solid, confident yes, then you're not ready to start summarizing yet. So again, every paragraph, every source is different. Some sources are going to be easy to summarize, just like some of these paragraphs are easy. Other times, you're going to have to really put in some work because some sources are difficult to understand. They might be very complex, they might be very lengthy, and it's going to take some time to summarize them. But let's actually get into some sort of brass tacks here, and let's get into the processes that I'm showing you in the overview. So again, if we're practice with some individual paragraphs first, like what you see on 76 and 77 of the reading. But just kind of play around with it, get comfortable with this basic process. But now let's talk about tackling entire sources, because that's obviously what we're going to be doing at the end of next week in our extended summary assignment. So again, number one, as you're reading, annotate. That's always going to be part of our work. Write down notes, ask yourself questions, and underline or circle key parts of the text. Number two, take your notes, take your questions, and take some of the things that you've underlined or circled or highlighted and start turning it into like a sequential list. And this can be very informal. This can remain in your notes. This can be in a Word doc or whatever, but you need to sort of get those notes in some kind of organized form. And again, they can just be sequential, chronological, going from first to last, start to finish. But start kind of putting them in a place or a form where you can see them all. And again, you might want to number them. It can often help to number your notes because a lot of those notes are going to find their way into your summary in some shape or form. Not all of them will, but you might want to number them or use letters and just kind of make a list of all the stuff that you wrote down while you were reading, or all the things that you underlined, all the things that you think are important and you might want to work with later. So that's step two, is taking your annotations and turning them into a sequential list of notes. Step three is, this is very important, vitally important, you must establish the thesis or the argument of your source. So again, you might have already written that down. A lot of people will underline what they think is a thesis statement if they find one in the source, or they might just jot down what they think the argument is in the margins or maybe at the end of the text. So maybe you've already kind of been thinking about the thesis, but if not, now is the time, obviously. And again, hopefully there's at least something in your notes that kind of gets you pointed in the direction of the overall thesis. Again, just like what we were saying, in some articles, the thesis will be easy to find. In other sources, you're going to have to really look for it, and there might not really be a thesis statement. You just have to create your own in your own words based on what you're seeing, what you see overall in the source. So again, jot down what you think the overall argument of the source is. Doesn't really matter where you write it down at this early stage, in your notes, or at the end of that sequential list of notes that you just wrote for step 2. But go ahead and jot down at least what you think the thesis is. And again, at this point, even if you think that you found a thesis statement, let's not quote that thesis statement. Let's put it in our own words. We're practicing that part of the process as well, taking the author's ideas and putting them into our own words and doing it clearly and accurately. That is a skill. That's an important skill in 102, and we're practicing it right now. And then the final step, once you have done 1 through 3, step 4 is to just take that sequential list of notes and maybe whatever you wrote down for the thesis and start turning all of that into paragraphs, sentences and paragraphs of your own. So there's no one right way of doing this, but if you follow steps 1 through 3, you're going to have some information written down, ideas, maybe questions, a few statements that you've maybe already sketched out, and that's the raw material that you can use in step 4 when you're actually building your own summary. Okay, so I just want to introduce our basic structure. So we're going to follow that 4-step process this week and next week, and really for the rest of the semester whenever we summarize. But to get a little more specific, I'm going to tell you the 3 specific areas that you need to cover in your summaries, the 3 basic things that all of our summaries have to have. So now we're in step 4. We are building our summaries. So here's what we need. And this is, again, in the overview. The 3 key elements for us when we're summarizing. Number 1, the introduction or the framework. Okay, let me explain what that means. What you're doing here is you're giving us an overall sense of the structure and the scope and the subject matter of your source. So this is obviously an important part here. I mean, again, the whole nature of the summary is to provide an overview, but we need an entry point. We need some kind of introduction to get into the source. And one thing that you have to remember when you're doing this work and our future work with sources, you have to remember that a lot of your readers aren't familiar with your sources. In fact, most of your readers will almost certainly not be familiar with your sources. So you can't assume that we know anything. So that introduction, it might just be a single sentence, but it needs to give us an overall sense, first of all, of what this article is even about. So we're not getting to the argument yet. We're kind of establishing topic here, subject matter, okay? But also the scope, right? We can kind of get a feel for how big this text is. Is it a 30-page academic journal article that's packed full of scientific detail and hard data and a lot of recent research? Or is it a 4 or 5 page magazine article that's got some good info, but maybe some pictures, and it's kind of a lighter read? It's intended for a general audience. You need to convey that to us. Okay, this is also where you're going to establish things like the author's name, things like the title of the source. You're introducing it to us. Think about introducing a friend to another friend, to people who have never met. You guys know how to do this, right? This is so-and-so, he lives blank, and here's an interest or a fun thing about him to help you to get to know each other. These are the basic things we do in introductions. So get us acquainted with the source, and give us a sense of what it's about, how big it is, and just that kind of overall, that real big overview. Okay, so that's the framework, that's part one. Part two is the arrangement of key ideas. So this is the bulk of your summary. Now you're presenting the most important ideas. Remember, we can't include everything, but we're including the most important ideas, the most critical claims, all the most important stuff. Now we're going through it in the body of our summary. So this will consist of multiple sentences, all right? And we are putting together all the most important stuff, once again, in our words. So if we did good notes, if we have a good sequential list of notes that we did earlier, again, let's say you have 10 or 12 little statements or notes listed out. You might go back and look at those and say, okay, 4 or 5 of those are not critically important. So I'm going to toss them, okay? But the other 5 or 6, those are all really important ideas. And you might decide, I need to include all 5 or 6 of these ideas or claims. They might be uses of evidence. They could be anything. They might be an example of the author using pathos. It might be an example of the author presenting hard data, numerical evidence. I don't know. It might be an original idea from the author. It might be the author using somebody else's research. Whatever you're finding, whatever you think is important, you have it listed. You have it written down already. So you can go back and take 5 of the most important points that you came up with. And then you can organize those 5 into a couple of paragraphs, or maybe you can combine certain ones. Okay, these two go together. I'm going to talk about these two in this first paragraph. Then I'm going to talk about these other 2 key points in the next paragraph. Start getting organized. Start arranging all of that material. And again, you might end up with 1, 2, maybe 3 paragraphs consisting of all of those key ideas that you've already underlined, you've already listed out, and now you're simply putting them in the form of complete sentences and complete paragraphs. And then by the end, the final element of our simple summary structure, the final part is the restatement of the thesis. Obviously, you have to tell us what the overall argument is, and while you're doing this, this is the conclusion. So while you're doing this, you can wrap it up. Anything else that you want to say, anything else that seems important. But remember what a conclusion should feel like. You're wrapping things up and giving us some closure, but it might not hurt to kind of link this to other sources or talk about some of the future considerations that this source might potentially lead to, whatever. But by the end of your summary, you must be sure to have restated the overall argument of the source in your own words. So I want you guys this week to practice kind of, using this simple structure that we're going to be using throughout this semester. So again, start with some individual paragraphs and go through the 4 steps that I just, walked you through in the top of the overview. And once you get comfortable just working with individual paragraphs, and again, you can use the same structure. It's just going to be shorter. So you can have you can do those 3 basic things, but they might just be over the course of a sentence or 2. But really with paragraphs, it's easy. And see if you can find those summary sentences that we were looking at in the PDF reading. So just practice with some paragraphs. If you have to do most of the work yourself, that's fine. If you can find a sentence in the paragraph that kind of serves as a summary of the paragraph, again, topic sentences often do that. If you can find that, that's great. But just practice with some individual paragraphs and then move up to a complete source. And again, follow those 4 steps, but make sure your structure includes all 3 of the elements that I just listed. Again, the intro/framework, that might just be a sentence or 2. The arrangement of key ideas, That might be a couple of paragraphs. It just depends on the length of the source. Next week, I'll get more specific about how long our summaries need to be. But for right now, when you're just practicing, it's no problem if your intro and conclusion are very brief, like single sentences. And then that, part two, the arrangement of key ideas, that might be a paragraph or two. Like, it's fine to kind of have really brief, kind of informal summaries right now. We're going to add a few more techniques soon. We're going to continue to practice, and by next week, we will be writing longer summaries. So for now, just practice, and remember, later in the week, I will post another lecture about quoting and paraphrasing. And then next week, we're going to put all of this together, summarizing, paraphrasing, and quoting. We're going to be doing all of that in our extended summary due at the end of week 7. So if you have any questions about what's going on right now, talk to me. Otherwise, I will see you later this week for part 2 of the week 6 lecture.